Hey guys, Mr. Backberg here. In this video, we're going to look at evaluating trig functions with a calculator. Being able to use a calculator to help you evaluate trigonometric functions allows you to concentrate more of your brain power on the problem-solving steps of a problem. But the problem we can run into is sometimes as you're using your calculator, you end up incorrectly asking it to evaluate something or to evaluate the wrong thing. Now, if you make a mistake, sometimes you're going to be lucky enough for your calculator to display an error message. But in most cases, you're going to see an answer that you might assume is correct, but is actually an incorrect answer. So it's important to know some of the common errors when you're evaluating trig functions using a calculator. And the first one that we run into a lot is that we're using our calculator in the wrong mode. So that means calculating things in degrees versus in radians, or vice versa. The mode your calculator needs to be in is dependent on the type of input information that you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with degrees as far as your angle measures, then we need to make sure that we're in degree mode. But if we're dealing in radians for our angle measures, then we need to make sure that our calculator is switched over to radian mode. Now this error is very, very common and it happens to everybody at least once in a while. Now as we're taking a look at these errors, I'm going to think back to my 30, 60, 90 triangle, and I want to think about the sine of a 30-degree angle. This is one that we said we should be able to figure out geometrically without needing to use our calculator, and we said that the sine of a 30-degree angle is always going to be 1/2. So as I go over to my calculator and I try to evaluate the sine of 30, I should get 1/2 as my answer. So in my calculator, when I type in the sine of 30 and I hit enter, I don't get 1/2 as my answer. And that's because if I check my mode, if I hit the mode button and I look down, my calculator is currently in radian mode. And that's typically the default set for your calculator. So if we're evaluating things that are in degrees, we need to make sure that we go into our mode and switch this over to degree mode. Now if I type in the sine of 30 and hit enter, I get that 0.5, I get that 1/2 that I was looking for. The next common error that we run into is using our inverse trig function keys to evaluate the cotangent, the secant, or the cosecant. Most calculators don't have buttons for cotangent, secant, or cosecant, and the reason is because they can be easily evaluated by just doing the reciprocal of your tangent, cosine, or sine. So again, I'm going to use what I know about the sine of 30 degrees being 1/2 to help me out. Now the reciprocal of the sine is the cosecant. So the cosecant of 30 should be 2 because that's the reciprocal of 1/2. So if I go over to my calculator, we sometimes see a -1 power used to show the reciprocal or to represent the reciprocal of something. And if I look directly above the sine button, there's a sign with a -1 power on there. But that does not mean the reciprocal of the sine. When you put a -1 power on a function, that means the inverse of that function. So if I try to hit that sine with a -1 power on it and type in my 30-degree angle, I get a domain error. But if I go back to my home screen, now there is actually a button on my calculator that I can use to help me evaluate this reciprocal function. So we're dealing with the sine of 30, but instead of finding the sine of 30, we said we wanted to find the cosecant, which is the reciprocal. So what I need to do is I need to close my parentheses because I'm done with this sine function. And if I look directly next to that sine function with that x with a -1 power on it, that'll actually give me a reciprocal of the answer for the sine of 30. So when I hit enter, I do get that answer of 2 that I was looking for. Now there is actually another way that we can find the cosecant, and that's by doing 1 divided by the sine of our 30-degree angle. So when I hit enter there, I will also get 2. So there's 2 separate ways for me to approach doing the cosecant in my calculator, but using that sine with the -1 power on it is not one of them. A third common error that we can run into is using function shorthand that our calculator doesn't recognize. And this usually happens when we're dealing with exponents or powers of trig functions. So we know that the sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. So if I wanted to square both sides of this equation, then there's actually a couple different ways that I can write this sine of 30 squared. One way is just by putting it inside of parentheses and putting the squared on the outside. The other way that we sometimes see used is putting our sine and then a squared directly on the sine of 30. Now this is a function shorthand that our calculator has problems with if we try to type that in. But when we take the sine of 30 degrees and square it, that 1/2 squared, we should end up getting 1/4. Now if I go over to my calculator, so if I want to try to take that sine of 30 and square it, using that function shorthand, a lot of times we see the sine put in there first and then squared. So as I try to type that into my calculator, it would look something like this. But it doesn't even look right with having that sine and then our parentheses with the squared in there. So as we're using powers on our trig function, so if I want to do the sine of 30 and square it, I make sure to type in my sine of 30 first, I close up the parentheses, and then I put the squared power on it. So now when I hit enter, I get that 0.25, or I get that 1/4 that we said we should get. And our fourth common error that we can run into is not closing parentheses appropriately. So we know that the sine of a 30-degree angle is 1/2. But if I wanted to look at the sine of 30 degrees plus 2, parentheses are going to be important because we need to decide, are we supposed to add that 2 to the 30 first and then evaluate the sine, or am I supposed to do the sine of 30 and then add 2 to that answer? So what I want to actually look at doing is I want to do the sine of 30 and then add 2 to that answer. So I've got those parentheses around the 30 to show that I'm stopping the sine function. So I'm evaluating the sine of a 30-degree angle, and then I'm supposed to add 2 to that answer. So I should get 2.5 or 2.5 as my answer. But if I go over to my calculator, so when I hit my sine button on my calculator, I can see that it automatically opens up a set of parentheses. So I have to be careful to make sure that I'm closing my parentheses in the appropriate spot. So if I want to do the sine of 30 and I just put the plus 2, my calculator will automatically close the parentheses at the end of the function if you don't close it by yourself. So if I hit enter, that'll give me something different than the 2.5 that I'm supposed to get, because my calculator is going to take that 30-degree angle and add 2 to it first before it evaluates the sine, because we didn't close the parentheses after the 30. So I have to do the sine of 30, close my parentheses to stop the sine function, and then add 2 to that to get that 2.5 that I wanted. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching.